Yes, started getting
Sorry.
it there. Yep, go for it. I see. Yeah, we started recording there. Fantastic. So, folks, worth knowing we're recording this event today. Yeah. So over the next hour, we're here to talk about freedom to read. And David and I both have our own particular experiences in conversations about freedom to read, freedom of expression. David has some very particular ones that I'm really excited to hear him talk about in this context. I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the outset setting up some of the issues, giving you a little bit of a sense of, a couple of definitions, a little bit of the data, and sort of why, these are really pressing issues to be talking about today. David's going to spend some time talking about some of the experiences that he's had, and then we're going to spend some time together talking about some of the strategies, ways of thinking about addressing book challenges, book bans, and questions of freedom of expression. And then we're hoping, time permitting, to have a small amount of time remaining for Q&A. So as we're speaking this morning, invite you folks to think about questions that you might have. As part of getting started too, one of the things I want to do, lest anywhere in this conversation it happened to not be remembered, it's worth noting that David is shortly going to be delivering a lecture in Edmonton, for those who are in Edmonton, on Wednesday, March 12th. Doors at 6:30, lecture at 7 o'clock at the Tim Center for the Arts. This is the annual CLC Kreisel lecture through the University of Alberta. The topic of that talk is writing as social activism. And if we can get the link into the chat. Yes, there it is. I see the link just showed up there. Thank you, Sarah and Ashley, both for putting that in there. So these are ongoing conversations, of course. So yeah, to set up the conversation today. So my own interest in this topic is, I want to say, in part an academic one, or in large part an academic one. It's one I've been developing over the last few years. I don't know about folks out there, but I myself find myself really overwhelmed by rising tides of backlash against progressive voices and like really reactionary politics taking place in the world. I find it really, really overwhelming. And for me, I feel that um, I can't address everything in the world right now. But one of the things I feel that I can address and have started to address in my work are questions of the repression of freedom of expression and repression, particularly of BIPOC and LGBTQ plus voices. And so I've been in the last few years, particularly at the University of Calgary, where I work as a faculty member, I've been teaching a course on banned and challenged books, and that informs a lot of what I want to say this morning. Um, the what we've been seeing over the last few years, particularly since about 2020, is a sharp rise, a sharp increase in challenges to books. It's been very public in the United States. It's also taking place in Canada in really important ways. And reckoning with that, grappling with that, and seeing the particular way, the sort of the patterns and trends in book challenges and book bans is really important. Now, I find myself saying book challenges and book bans sort of in tandem right away, and I want to give a couple quick definitions for that. And these come from the American Libraries Association. The ALA in the United States has done a good job for a long time of generating data and advocacy for freedom of expression. The ALA's distinction, so they distinguish between book challenges and book bans, and they track both very closely in their work. For the ALA, a challenge is an attempt to remove or restrict materials based upon the objections of a person or a group, while a banning is the removal of those materials. So when we're talking about book bans, we can say that a book has been banned as soon as it has faced a removal in one context or more based on any challenge that's taken place. And in that context, we can say the book bans have risen dramatically again since in the last few years, particularly like since around 2020. There's have been huge increases, massively well organized and well coordinated challenges to books. These have been recorded a lot in the United States. And we're talking like massive year-over-year increases. 2023, the ALA's data found, I think, a 92% increase in challenges between 2023 and 2022. And we're talking about like thousands of individual book titles being challenged. This is in public libraries, in school libraries. If you talk to, if you're in your local community library, I really encourage you to talk to your local librarians about the experiences that they've had, because they have had in some cases, really difficult confrontations with community members and organized groups endeavoring to have materials removed from libraries. That's been talked about much more publicly in the United States than it has in Canada. But it's also something that is absolutely taking place in Canada. And David's going to talk about some of his experiences with this in just a moment. Um, One of the things that the CBC has just been reporting, and some people may have seen this, there's a conversation right now happening that's connected to particularly the community of Valley View in northern Alberta, where there is a strong pushback against the local community library there, which is the library that has been the community hub in Valley View that has been host to the Communities Gay Straight Alliance for a number of years. There, in seeming response to the community library's support for LGBTQ2S plus community members, there is a strong pushback against this that the CBC has been documenting, and I encourage folks to look at what the CBC has been finding there. Some of the data that the CBC reports there is they look at some data from the Canadian Federation of Libraries Associations, which finds that while we've been publicly seeing stuff in the news out of the United States, the Canadian Federation for Library Associations has recently crunched some data and suggested that the number of book challenges per capita may in fact be higher in Canada than in the United States. So we're seeing this in the news. It's reflected in a whole bunch of different ways. These things are taking place. And from my perspective, as someone who is an educator and a writer, and someone who believes strongly in the importance of freedom of expression and the exchange of difficult, divergent, diverse viewpoints, I'm extremely concerned in this time. And so I really think it's deeply important that we talk about these things. I have many more things to say. I have a course that I teach on this subject. I have some writing that I've been doing in this. But at this point, I'd like to invite David into the conversation because David's had some really important firsthand experiences. So David, if I can turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kit. Hello, everybody. How's it going? Happy weekend. Yeah, I guess I can just talk to you about just the couple things that I've been through personally. Keeping in mind as well that, like I think that definitely Indigenous literature is a target. But the vast majority of books that are challenged and banned are from the LGBTQI2S community. And so I have a bunch of my friends in the literary community have had their books taken off shelves and out of classrooms quite regularly. So I do have some firsthand experience actually as well. I just had a teacher message me privately yesterday and told me that, by the way, that your book Betty is still not recommended in Alberta. So so that I didn't know that was still happening. Not surprised though. So the first time this really happened to me it was actually pre-2020, when there was a books to weed out list that was posted online by the Edmonton Public School System. And it was a little odd. I mean, because not only was it being shared on social media, but there was also people kind of making fun of it as well on social media, like making light of it, which I found a little distasteful. There was a teacher who made me aware of the list because several of my books were on this books tweet out list. The books tweet out list was primarily, in this case, the majority of them were from Indigenous writers, and what I found with and this is what you'll find, I think, with a lot of books that are banned, the rationale behind the banning is never really holds water, because I don't think that at least with the majority of these challenges, that the people have even read the books. So the rationale, for example, with Seven Generations, which was my first published graphic novel. It's also one of the first graphic novels that addressed residential school history in Canada. It was banned because it visually inferred abuse, was one of the reasons. And obviously, residential schools had abuse that occurred in them. So that book was also aimed at, senior years to grade 8 and up level readers. So it was age appropriate. The problem back then, I guess, was that we weren't really teaching on a wide scale residential school history to younger readers. And so, and as well, I don't think as teachers, there was a lot of preparation to be able to teach the things that we were beginning to address in schools, which needed to be addressed. So there's a lack of readiness, I think, in part. And so that led to one of the reasons being, well, it visually infers abuse, so we can't have that. The other reason was, this was probably the most baffling reason, was that it required pre and post conversations in the classroom, which I think is probably the job of the teacher to do. So that was something that I didn't really understand. So I mean, I think one of the things that I found has been very effective in fighting against challenges and book bannings, is social advocacy. So the only thing I really did for that was I mean, I did a lot of media, but I shared the website online and just told people what was happening. The website was taken down pretty quickly after that. Very soon after that, though, I was made aware of a larger list that was provincial wide, that was put together by Alberta Ed. And there's a group of people, a committee was vetting resources to on the subject of reconciliation, for vetting resources, and several of my books in that case as well were being weeded out, were not being vetted through. And I remember having a conversation. I think is the minister was Dave Eggins. Is that what his name is? Yeah, Dave Eggins. So I had an email exchange with Dave Eggins about it. And the rationale as well in that case was a little troubling. One of the teachers who made me aware of this large list told me that Betty, which is still apparently not recommended, which is about a woman named Helen Betty Osborne. It's a graphic novel that addresses missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which is a really important subject, and it's an epidemic in Canada. There's a genocide that's happening against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people. But he was told to stop teaching my book almost halfway into class by an administrator because the book had also inferred abuse, but there's also a problematic author, which I guess is me. I don't know why it was problematic, but and so he was told to stop teaching it, and he felt like his job was in jeopardy if he didn't. So he stopped teaching it, but he let me know privately as well that was happening. So that larger list, when I wrote Egan's back about that, he ignored me. But I never really heard much about it after that, and I assume that I guess that these these lists still exist in Alberta. I'm sure they exist elsewhere in Canada as well. So that was my first real experience with it. But what happened, I guess, a few years later was that the Durham District School Board in Ontario had circumvented their own policy, first of all, which was the big problem on addressing book challenges by immediately pulling books rather than go through the review process. And my book, along with two others, were taken off of shelves and out of classrooms unceremoniously. And it was because of a challenge that happened from an outside source. And the rationale for that too was the main ones, I think, were that the book was harmful to Indigenous children, which is, I mean, I've spent my career trying to empower Indigenous kids, so that was a little bit hard to take. And then the other one was that they didn't teach culture, and all books are culture. So I think one of the points of concern for me was that all books are culture. So what we're doing is we're just selecting what cultures we teach, which cultures we do not teach. So in both cases, what I found, and we'll probably get to this, is that mobilization of community, I think, was really important in speaking out against book challenges, in this case, book bannings as well. And then holding it to account, school boards, or libraries to not only have policies in place, but to follow those policies, which didn't happen in the case of Durham District School Board in Ontario. But the experiences with those three things, it really made me intimately aware of the issue of book bannings and book challenges. It made me be a more active advocate for freedom to read, and it's something that I've continued to be since that time, because what I find is, I don't know if it's ironic or not, but the policies often are put in place, I believe, to try and protect children. Children don't need to be protected from books. The books need to be protected, and so policies, I think, need to protect books. Children are just fine, at least within the context of literature. So.
Well, there's a whole bunch of things in there that I know I want to follow up on, and so maybe I can sort of I'll ask you just sort of a few more questions about some of these things, and then I know we want to talk about sort of more about different kinds of strategies and different kinds of approaches. In that sense, with your work, I'd been aware of some of these things going on in the background, and then it was the case with in the Durham District School Board with the Great Bear, when I sort of became really sort of prominently aware, very very aware of the extent to which your work specifically is being challenged, and then particularly ways in which Indigenous authors are facing different kinds of I want to say scrutiny, or different kinds of uh, challenges or repression in ways that I think other writers are not. I'm curious because and then I watched that unfold over a series of news articles over a series of days, and the story itself sort of happened fairly quickly, but I think it's got a longer afterlife to it. Like you say for yourself, learning more or sort of becoming more dedicated to freedom to read causes. I I think I want to ask you to maybe talk a little bit more about the sort of like the very public facing nature of how that debate unfolded.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the educators were afraid to speak out
Mhm.
about it. It was a very public issue, and educators and administrators who contacted me about it, board members who contacted me about it, didn't want me to use their names because they were afraid for their jobs. People's jobs were being threatened, and so that it was a very troubling thing because if you know there's a problem and you're afraid to speak out about it, I don't know what you can do to address the problem, and I guess the one thing that they could do, because I understand it's their livelihood, is to talk to someone who they know might be able to advocate for, the books that are being challenged, which I was willing to do. So that was that was I think what I believe one of the things we need to be able to do is to have courage in our conviction to
Mhm.
speak out about these things. If we're really passionate for and believe in a child's right to read and the benefits of reading diverse literature, then we have to be willing to stand up for it at a cost, and so like I mean, it had an emotional investment for me in speaking about it very publicly. I didn't expect it to have the kind of media attention that it got. But I think that that's one of the things that also helped that decision to be overturned, is because it had such attention in the media, in both the social media and in the media, in news articles and TV and radio and print. And I think that's what I was talking about. The mobilization is so important, and having I don't know if you call it courage, but the conviction to be able to speak out for the things that you really believe in, and really believe that children should have access to. I know that when a couple of my friends, Danny Ramadan and Robin Stevenson, had their books challenged in Waterloo Catholic District School Board recently, just last year, I believe. My first response was that Well, I'm not going to go there because I just planned a school tour at the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, and so I was getting paid pretty good amount to go visit their schools and talk to their kids, and my first response was to email the administration and be like, well, I'm not going to go, unless you put those books back on the shelves, I'm not going, and then so I canceled my trip, and on second thought, I thought, well, actually. I think I should probably go. And instead of talking about my books, I'm going to talk about banned literature.
Mhm.
So, I think, but those are I think the decisions that we have to make, collectively. If we really are going to continue to fight against these things, we have to do it very publicly and we have to do it fearlessly. Um, and yeah, I think there's a cost to that. But I think we have to be willing to pay that cost in order to ensure that youth have access to information that will lead us to leadership in the future that will make better decisions. Because it's going to
Mhm.
be the kids that do that. And I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I mean, it probably expanded on it a little bit. But
No, 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 it really does. And I think it makes me think too about that there's, I think, a really important context when we think about schools and schooling. The case I was talking about in Valley View up in northern Alberta, it sounds like what the town council there has done is they voted right now to close their public library and to move the public library into a new, soon to be built new facility that's going to be the new community school, as well as have the public library in it. And the concern, and this is how CBC puts it, is they say, and this is directly from the article, the space afforded to the library will be half its current size and potentially be subject to restrictive provincial rules around 2S LGBTQ plus expression in schools. And for folks in Alberta, we've seen this unfold recently, right? That the provincial government has enacted a series of laws that target LGBTQ2S plus youth, particularly targeted at trans youth. And when we're in schools, there's particular kinds of legislation that are obtaining particular kinds of restrictions and restraints that face educators in particular ways. And so there's lots of different cases. I've been sort of tracking these for the last few years of cases where educators in particular are being targeted for the kinds of material they're including in the classroom. There was one case fairly recently. This was in Texas, so the U.S. context is of course different, but I think it comes to bear, and some of the organizing very much is cross-border here. There's a case in the United States of a teacher who was fired from a grade eight as a grade eight teacher after objections to his teaching the graphic novel version of the Diary of Anne Frank in a classroom. Uh, and I would say, like, teaching the Diary of Anne Frank to me is a deeply, deeply important thing to do. There's a conversation with the graphic novel version of that book, but teachers who are literally being fired over the choices that they're making in the classroom, I can think of other such examples. Um, and one I think really, to me, distressing new law that's been passed recently in Utah. Folks may have seen this one. This just came into effect in the last couple months. There's a new law in Utah that requires that a book in that state be removed from all public schools in the state if three or more school districts determine that book has objective and sensitive material in it. So what this means is, like, three school districts can get together and say, we don't like David Robertson's books. We want them removed from the whole state, and they can make that happen now. There's another part, two school districts and five charter schools. But the main thing is a small number of school districts can determine, the outcome for a whole state and restrict what is available to youth across that. In the case, since that law has come into effect, it's been very clear. Almost all of the books that have been removed from schools in Utah have almost all been by women. So, like, the pattern is absolutely clear in terms of what kinds of books are being targeted. For fans of Sarah J. Maas, I don't know if we have any fans of Sarah J. Maas here this morning, but if you're folks are reading the Court of Thorn and Roses and those series, those are some of the books that are being all removed in schools in Utah. So I think, like, that education context really, really matters, right? So when you're saying, the willingness and ability to speak publicly about these issues, I think, is in dialogue with that complexity of schooling. So I know you do a lot of work in schools. I'm curious what you're seeing on the ground a little bit more with teachers. You're saying, some teachers are well aware that their positions are on the line, in effect.
yeah, absolutely they are. And I think we shouldn't fool ourselves to think that if that's a rule in Utah, then they're going to be a targeted attack. There's going to be divisions that commiserate together and attack books intentionally to get them banned in the entire state, because that's what people will do, And so it's yeah, but I think there is definitely a fear in teachers in their professions and their livelihood. What I find is so troubling about, especially like the targeted attacks against the LGBTQI2S community. It's this. So I can kind of trace why some of these things are happening. You have parents, grandparents, but primarily those are where these challenges come from.
Mhm.
Parents, grandparents, the community, who didn't learn about these things growing up. And so there's like an ingrained ignorance, and uncomfortableness and fear because we fear what we don't know. And so you have parents, grandparents who primarily as well, we should also know that the challenges come from the far right or the right, and usually in the Bible belts. This where it happens in Manitoba. A lot of the book challenges that are happening in the Bible Belt in conservative areas. So that there's definitely a pattern there as well. So knowing where those things are coming from is really important. But the irony is, you know, I guess the fear is indoctrination. So if you read this book, you're going to be gay or something. I don't know. Like I don't know I don't know what it is. It is. I mean, it sounds silly to say that. Is because the arguments are silly. Dave Levithan wrote a book called Answers in the Pages, and the setup in that book was actually quite brilliant. And it had a parent who read literally the last paragraph of one book, nothing else, where two boys hug, and that's it. And that set this parent off to challenge this book and have it removed from schools. And the brilliant thing that Dave did as well was he had the actual content of the book in his book, so that if you read the book, you also actually read the book that the parent didn't read. You get to
Right.
see the absolute like ridiculousness of this challenge. Now, in terms of indoctrination, like first of all, if you're gay, you're gay. A book is not going to make. I mean, everyone here knows that. But the book, what the harm happens to in removing these books, removing the books doesn't remove the people. So in a community, you still have a community that is rich and diverse, with whether it's the BIPOC people or the LGBTQIA2S community. Like those people still live with us. They still live in our communities. The harm that happens is because we're taking away the kids' opportunity to learn about people who they share this community with, that they're in class with, and that lack of understanding and that the ignorance that grows from that lack of understanding perpetuates a continued cycle of harm against a group of people that have been historically targeted and harmed. I mean, it's really hard to take if you're a rational human being to see
Mhm.
these things continue to happen. And for teachers who have their hands tied, there's such empathy for that. I had a librarian in the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, and after I said that I wasn't coming anymore, he emailed me and said, like, asked me to still come, but he's like, my kid is trans. Like, I don't want this to happen. I don't have a choice here. What are we supposed to do? And so, I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah. Well, and so on that note, to think a bit about, again, some of the titles that are really being challenged the most, and I can think a bit about my own classrooms from that. We're waiting right now for the 2024 data to all be finalized. We're like, expecting it to arrive fairly soon, both on, in Canada and the United States for it to be compiled. The 2023 and 2022, the title in both Canada and the United States that was the most frequently challenged or removed was the book Genderqueer, which is a
Mhm.
memoir by Maya Kobabe. It's for folks who might not have seen this book. It's a graphic memoir. It is, I think, a From my perspective, it is a deeply thoughtful, quite beautiful, and like really like gentle and slow-paced meditation on coming of age and working through questions of gender and sexuality. It has been attacked consistently. It has been faced all kinds of challenges, and it has been removed in all kinds of different contexts. So, the most challenged in the last few years. I'm also brought to mind of, and this would be to your point about, books that are being challenged without being read. There's a fairly well-known case in a school district in Florida where the book version of Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem, The Hill We Climb, which is the inauguration poem for the Biden administration, was removed from a school there, ultimately moved and reshelved. And if you know this poem, if you might have seen Amanda Gorman perform that at the Biden inauguration, this was sort of widely broadcast. I would describe that as again, a very gentle, very middle of the road poem about sort of American progress. That poem was removed on the basis of one objection from someone who described it as containing hate messages, but but from someone who had not read it. And it was successfully removed from a school district there too. So, these certainly are cases of removals without being read, without being investigated and taken. And then your point too earlier about the challenge of the Great Bear with then a school board that didn't follow their own policies. One of the things I know I certainly think about, and this is now where we're thinking more actively about, I think, strategies for how we confront and deal with these things. One of the questions I think does become one of strategy. When I'm teaching about banned and challenged books, one of the questions I often get is, what kinds of policy provide guidance for either schools or community libraries or other organizations for this stuff? And one of the things I've certainly seen is it's very, very piecemeal. It's very ad hoc. Some places do have policies, some places don't have policies, and then things are determined on the fly. I'm curious. This, you talk about the experience with the Durham district, but is there other moments where we might think about policy as being maybe a useful tool in this context?
Absolutely. But, I think also, first of all, policy needs to be, I think, mandated
Hmm.
and integrated properly into, the school boards
Hmm.
across Canada. So I think it needs to be consistent,
Hmm.
and I think there also needs to be an accountability to follow policy, because like who's if a policy is ignored or not followed, then who's responsible for that?
Hmm.
Whose head will roll if they don't follow their own policy that is set to protect literature. I don't think anybody got in trouble for not following policy at the Durham District School Board. I think the person who's involved with it has now left the board, but I don't know. I don't think it's because of that. Um, so, and it was odd, when I talked to Jerem and I said, your policy doesn't say to you for you to do this. Your policy says you have to review it first and then remove it. So what are you doing?
Hmm.
And they said, well, our indigenous policy is different. And I said, okay, well, what is the indigenous policy then? They said, well, they gave me a link to the page. So I followed the link to the page. I don't know if they thought I wasn't going to look or not. The indigenous policy was said to refer back to the school policy, to the school board policy. So the school board policy said you need to take these challenges in, review them, and then make a decision based on that review. But they didn't do that. So you have to follow the policy. Now, the policies need to be, you're right, not ad hoc. They need to be very carefully and thoughtfully established. The first thing that I would do for every policy in a library or school board that comes from wherever that challenges a book, the person who challenges that book needs to have read the book.
Hmm.
That policy, I think, is pretty simple. And how do you establish that? Maybe you have to write some sort of a little test, just articulating your knowledge about the literature in question to show that you've actually read the damn thing. If you can't prove that you've read it, then you have no right challenging it. You know, so I think that will actually address a lot of the issues, not all of them, but a lot of them, because I do think the majority of the challenges that come from people are from people who have not read the literature. They're just
Mhm.
saying, well, well, I just don't agree with the LGBT community. It's
Mhm.
like, well, so I don't like this book because I know this book is like LGBT themed, but they haven't read it. So, that requires people to actually read literature.
Which is a tall
You
order,
know,
it turns out.
yeah, totally, totally. But I mean, it's a simple inclusion in the policy that would, I think it would go a long way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes me think a little bit about my classroom. So I'll just say a little bit about that. And then I'm thinking more about as folks who are artists, how like art itself responds to some of these things. I'll say in my classroom, so I teach like a large first year class at the University of Calgary. It's designed to be like for students across the university. It fulfills a first year requirement for students. Just it's called Literature and Society, and my particular approach to it is banned and challenged books. So I teach a number of these books. I teach genderqueer. I've been teaching The Great Bear. I've been, teaching a number of other books in this class and thinking about it in a range of ways, lots of disciplines. And with 120 students, the conversations can become really, really interesting. One of the things I find in that class is when I ask my students, by and large, so it's designed as a first year class, so it's by and large, quite young folks between 18 and 20 years old, roughly. If I ask them if they want other people to determine what kinds of content they should get to read, or what kinds of books they should access. Like, do they want, censorship and things that control what they're going to read? The overwhelming answer is no. They would like to make their own decisions for themselves. They would like to be empowered to make their own choices. And then as the semesters unfolded, I've taught this course in this way twice now. As the semesters unfolded, one of the things that comes up is, at one point or another, some of the books that we read will evoke discomfort in my students, and that's been fairly clear. And I welcome that discomfort, and I invite conversations about the discomfort when it arises. Um, but there's both iterations of this course so far. I've seen kind of a switch partway through the semester where they'll say, "I don't want anybody to decide what I should read, but now that we're reading this book, I don't think it's appropriate for other people. I don't think kids should have access to this book, or I'm not so sure." And watching that sort of anxiety kind of pop up in the classroom, and then seeing that unfold and finding ways to challenge it has been really interesting. So I think there is something interesting when you're talking about this mini book bans, book challenges being driven by a purported desire to protect kids, whereas I agree with you absolutely that it's in fact the books that need protecting. I've seen that pop up where people say for themselves they don't want to, they want the freedom to make those decisions, but then they get uncomfortable once they're actually confronted with the material. I find that really interesting. I don't know if there isn't really a question in that, but I find that an interesting just thing to have seen happen. Um, I'm wondering about, as a writer, as an artist, the kinds of ways in which these questions then come into the work that you're doing. Are there, I don't know if for you that's sort of like consciously been the case. I hear you sort of saying like, one of the things that's clear for you is to continue to do the work and continue to, confront difficult questions, difficult material, to do so in a way that is accessible and open for youth. But I'm curious about the kinds of impacts on your work itself.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that happens just from the impacts of book challenges, um, and I think I don't know if I would call it a misnomer or what I would call it, but um, there's often a response that's like, well, when people challenge books, Canadians who generally don't like book bannings, they'll go and buy them. So when I've had a book challenged, whether it's Seven Generations or The Great Bear or Betty or whatever it is, all of a sudden like it'll shoot up to like, bestseller list, for a week or two. But it's helpful. But I mean, having class sets purchased,
Mhm.
having them taught in schools, having them stocked in library shelves is far more effective for me just from a profession standpoint than having 2 weeks of book sales, where my book is bought more than it has been in other weeks. So I mean, it's not, yes, you should support banned literature by going out and buying it when it's banned, but it hurts the author, these book challenges and book bannings, because having like class sets bought and repurchased every year is one of the ways that we have significant and consistent sources of income, and to be able to for us to continue to do our work, as artists. So I mean, so that's something that I think I just as an artistic standpoint and a profession standpoint, I think is should be mentioned. That's one thing. You know, I don't allow in my profession, in my practice, the prospect of book challenges to impact the work that I do.
Hmm.
I am prepared for it if it happens, but I don't let it at all dictate the work that I write, or the characters that I create, or the worlds that they live in, or the topics that I address. Um, that's if I did, I'd be giving into fear myself, and so I don't really much care to do that. So I'll write characters like the Barren Grounds, which is probably one of the better selling Canadian kids books in the last 5 years. Morgan's gay.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, so a lot of people, the Great Bear being challenged has nothing to do with her being gay. Maybe because people haven't read the book. I don't know, but like, so I'll continue to represent community in my literature. And in my community, there
Hmm.
are LGBTQIA2S people. There
Hmm.
are Indigenous people. There are kids in foster care. There are all these different diverse and marginalized groups that require and deserve representation in literature. And so I don't let it at all affect the practice, in my practice as a writer, or what I write about.
Hmm.
I am prepared to fight for it though, if it happens. Like when I got that email yesterday from that teacher, I was like, where? You know, let's go. And
Hmm.
she was like, well, the teacher didn't want me to didn't want me to say. I was like, okay, well then I can't really do much. So, you know, so I that's fine. I get where that's coming from. But one of the things that we can do when we're like dealing with challenged literature, which people have the right to do, people have the right to challenge literature, um, is to and book bannings, is to notify the artists. And so that's if we don't know, if we're not told, we don't know.
Hmm.
So, and when we know, then we're able to mobilize, and then
Hmm.
then we're able to fight against it. So I think that that's a big thing. We have it in Brandon recently, in Manitoba, where there was a grandparent who is, I think, an ex-school, ex teacher or something, and retired teacher maybe. But the grandparent wanted a committee of parents and grandparents to be able to vet literature going into schools, put a motion forward to have that happen. And the amount of people that showed up to fight against that required a change of venue. There's hundreds of people who showed up to fight against it, and that motion was stricken. So that's one of the ways that we can really fight against it, is coming together as a community,
Hmm.
and despite whatever fears we might have, um, because there is strength in numbers, and these book challenges are coming from a minority. You know,
Hmm.
it's just that sometimes the smallest people are have the biggest voices. So we need to make our voices louder.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the determination and as well as like the energy that goes into that. Like, I think, um, I'm finding it interesting in my conversations with folks who work in libraries, but also with other authors, other writers, that like there is some of that fear of being attacked, fear of job loss, fear of like all kinds of different things, and that fear of being attacked by a small but very vocal set of folks who are really committed to challenging and removing books. I think of you know I'm glad to hear that in your own practice you're really dedicated to not to self-censor yourself. I remember an article from Marshall Ederman in the Globe and Mail a while ago on this topic where She was thinking about the extent to which, for her, the possibility of self-censorship exists. And Marshall Lederman is, one of the reporters who, for folks in the room, who follows the Canadian literary landscape in the most detail and with the most depth. Don't always agree with Marshall Lederman, but I was very much appreciate her coverage and her sort of thinking through some of those issues and self-censorship in her own work. I thought was a one of those things that really kind of gave me pause to realize that, even if, books are, when they're challenged, those challenges are being resisted, as in the case of Brandon, which I thought was a really interesting one there too, where, the idea of establishing a board was, I think, in part being presented to the community as a way of like ensuring community standards, but under more scrutiny was in fact about creating censorship in the community, and that Brandon resisted that. I thought was really important. Um, yeah, thinking about ways in which self-censorship, I think maybe entering into the ways in which authors are thinking about their work, I think is really important to grapple with too. Um, I think at this point, David, are you all right to start to turn over to questions from the folks here, or do you have additional points you want to make sure we get in before we do that?
Um, no, I would just say that, like if we give into things like this, like I mean, for me, there would have been like a When We Were Alone. There never would have been the Barren Grounds. There never would have been a Betty. There never would have been Seven Generations. There never. I mean, and I think those books have done good things.
Mhm.
So, I don't know. I mean, I I get the fear of losing a job. I really do. My thought is always, do I want to work for some place that is going to do that to literature and hurt the community in that way? I mean, it's easy to say that because I'm not employed by this school board. But um, anyway, no, I don't have much to add other than just
Yeah.
just
I think so. So let me start to invite folks then, preparing questions. I see there's one already from Allison in the chat here, and I'll just read this one out while other people may be thinking about questions that they have. So the question is, there seems to be an organized effort from extreme right wing in Alberta to take over boards. Can you comment on this and what progressives who value freedom to read can do? David, I don't know if you want to start on this one or I can. I have some thoughts here.
I mean, you live there.
I
You could
do.
probably start on
Um,
it.
yeah, I don't know if this is a direct reference or not to the Take Back Alberta movement. People in Alberta are likely to be somewhat familiar with Take Back Alberta, which is an organized right-wing group led by the leader of Take Back Alberta is a man named David Parker. This is a group that has been working very closely inside the United Conservative Party to influence policy and decisions that are being made there. Take Back Alberta is indeed, one of the organizations that is thinking about books and about what's going on in libraries. In the CBC article, and I should just drop this article into our chat for folks who are interested to follow up with this one. They talk about Take Back Alberta in this article about Valley View Library, and there it is. This is they talk specifically about an event where the Take Back Alberta folks were, and this is a quote again from the CBC, where an audience was told that books, libraries, and schools are weapons being used to corrupt children's souls and destroy Western civilization. So like that, and Take Back Alberta is a large, politically organized group, and I think they are interested in things like the possibilities of being involved with boards. They've been involved with um, like say within the UCP in terms of influencing policy there, but also in terms of smaller communities, different kinds of boards. Certainly, I think progressives who value freedom to read, for those who have the capacity, the energy, the space in their lives to do so, I see calls often to become involved in like local community libraries, local forms of governance, those kinds of things. Like the example of the Brandon, the pushback in Brandon against establishing, formal mechanism for censorship in libraries, showing up to those kinds of things are the kinds of things that I think people can do. I always, in those contexts, encourage people to do so when they have the capacity to do so, because we all have different capacities, and I think a lot of people often feel pushed or strained beyond their capacity. So, figuring out what it is that one can do. But I think that's one of the approaches that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I wouldn't add much to that, 'cause I think part of it is the mobilization and like speaking out and standing up, I think is so important, especially just for the public, to show up and to speak out. I think, in every instance that I've seen, the reversal of challenges comes from public pressure, and so and that's holding to account. That's what it is. And so, and oftentimes under pressure, just this is how you deal with bullies.
Mhm.
Bullies are cowards.
Sarah.
Thanks so much for this conversation. It's really interesting, it was reminding me of when I was in high school, which is, I believe, when both of you were in high school. Um, we read Beatrice Mazanier's book In
Mhm.
Search of April Rain Tree, and in the classroom we had a redacted version that cut out a scene of sexual abuse. Um, that I guess they didn't want people to have to, to either be triggered by or have to deal with in the classroom. But I remember our teacher told us right away that we just had to walk down the hallway to the school library and the full version was there. So of course that's what we all did. And anyway, I was just wondering if that's a practice, the redacting of books for classrooms, if that's something that still happens. I hadn't actually thought about that in a really long time. And
Mhm.
I'm not sure actually, Sarah. I mean, we went to the same high school, the same grade, so I I mean, I wrote a paper about that in university about the redaction of the rape scene in April Raintree. And I know that didn't really like that, but B is a friend of mine now, and so I don't know if that's happening still with literature today. Kit, you might know more than me. I haven't heard a lot of that happening. I haven't really heard of it happening at all today. What I have seen happen is teachers, when they do read alouds, they kind of censor as they read to, whether it's like to address language that they feel like isn't age appropriate or content, they might read around it. But like I haven't seen much redaction happen, if any, that I'm aware of today. I'm not sure though. You might know more than I would, but
Oh, I'm trying to think of examples in Canada specifically, and they don't come to mind. I think adaptations I would think of more than as redactions. So, for instance, like graphic novel adaptations, the graphic novel version of The Handmaid's Tale, for example, which is somewhat simplified but retains the difficult materials. I think allow books to circulate in different contexts, and then in fact the Handmaid's Tale graphic novel version is one that has also been frequently challenged. So yeah, I think in Canada I don't particularly see those things. There are different, I think, discussions happening sometimes in the United States, but I'm struggling to sort of pinpoint a single one at the moment.
yeah, I can't think of one either. But the April Rain Tree is a very famous one
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was censored. I would call it censored, but um, yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. I see a question from Mandy in the chat bar. So not aware this is occurring in Canada. Glad to share this information, and I just distressing though it is. I mean, I think it's good, important to know that this happening in Canada. Your question, what would you recommend we can do proactively to ensure we are part of the solution to ban and challenge books? I think one of the first things that comes to mind for me is if you're someone who goes to your community library, go into the library, take a minute to thank a librarian. Gosh, librarians are extremely important. And
Hmm.
the work that they do is really important. And I do know that a number of librarians are like really facing sort of, uh, angry confrontations, sometimes like sort of frontline abusive confrontations from some community members who are seeking to have materials removed. So my starting point would be to say thank a librarian, please.
Yeah, I would agree. Librarians, teachers who bring these books into their classrooms despite what they know they might face. Librarians who stock it on their shelves. Yeah, teachers, educators, really are incredibly brave, hardworking people, and I think that support is important. I would agree with that 100%.
Yeah, and it's also very true. I'm not sure the community members always are aware of this, but if you're going to a local library and you discover that a book that you're interested in is not on the shelves or that isn't being held in the system, you can request it from the library. Libraries have systems for acquisitions, and part of it comes from community requests. So, if they don't have the Great Bear, then, request the Great Bear. If they don't have Betty, request Betty. Request authors' books, request those challenged books be on the shelves. And librarians take that very seriously. That kind of advocacy from community is really important. I think we have perhaps time for one more question before we're going to be out of time. Anyone? Any takers? Lana, I see that your comment that your son is just about to enter the schooling system, and in that context too, I think of the importance of being grateful for teachers and the work that teachers do. Teachers in Alberta, but also elsewhere, work in systems that are often chronically underfunded, undersupported, with far more students in the classroom than often allows them to be able to provide the absolute best that they could. They are absolutely they are trained professionals with a lot of excellence in terms of what they do, and I think it's really important to be to offer support to and gratitude to the folks who are teaching young people and doing so often in the face of, I want to say, market hostility from the governments that are there to create and support the systems. In Alberta, I think the at times like disdain that the provincial government directs towards the teaching profession really alarms me. So also supporting teachers, I think of as deeply important.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a bit worried.
Mm.
And so with this education now, and I worked in the system for 11 years. So with this education now, I kind of know too, like things that I should expose my son
Mhm.
to, and that I particularly didn't get taught in a small town, conservative community, right? So like even my husband has a lot more education on important topics here in the big city than I did, right? So I have to kind of keep that in line too for what we expose our son to and to teach him like the truths about things. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, in that context, also, in terms of like resources for thinking about how to teach youth and expose youth to a wide range of diverse literatures and views. Some of the organizations in Canada that we can point to as we move towards wrapping up, I think are really important. Media are covering these things on an ongoing basis. As has come up a couple times today. It's also important to think about the Canadian Federation for Libraries Associations. The Canadian Federation for Libraries Associations maintains a Canadian Library Challenges database that they started in the last few years. This is in collaboration with Toronto Metropolitan University, so the system now in place for tracking the data around library challenges that I think is really important. PEN Canada is an organization that is dedicated to freedom of expression, and they have been doing a number of events around freedom to read lately. The Writers Union of Canada, also an important organization that is involved with Freedom to Read Week, and this is a national organization for professionally published writers. And then, of course, the organization that's brought us here today, the Writers Guild of Alberta, sponsoring events like this one and ensuring that we're having these conversations in community, I think is deeply important as well. But David, I'd like to give the final word to you, if you don't mind.
Oh my goodness. I would just, I will quote Stephen King when I wrap it up. And Stephen King, to paraphrase, I think his quote is, we should be reading the books that they're trying to take away from us. Those are the books that we should be reading. So reading them, advocating for them, fighting for them, recognizing the importance of our kids reading these books, whether it's independently or with direct learning in the classroom, it prepares them to be stronger community members and to build better communities. And so I'll always be an advocate for and fight for freedom to read. I think we all should be warriors for freedom to read as well. So
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thanks everyone for being here this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you for spending an hour with us. And thanks so much to Kit and David. That was a really awesome conversation. And yeah, go out there, request banned books from your libraries and buy them from your indie bookstores. And yeah, keep fighting the good fight. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, folks.